what I'm going to talk about today, I've called it the last draft with a question mark after it. And what I'm going to talk about is that whole process of drafting and redrafting a long piece of fiction. And some of what I'm going to say could apply, I suppose, to short stories, but I'm really thinking about a full-length novel, or at the very least something like a novella, something that's 100 pages or more than that. I should say right away that everything I'm about to say to you in the next 30 minutes or so is just my take on this process. There is no definitive right way to write a novel, and there's no definitive right way to go through the various drafts of that novel. So all I can really do is talk about how I go about it, and I hope that the information that I pass on is useful to you. Anyway, I'm in the final stages of completing a novel of about 130,000 words, which is probably equates to about 350 pages in a printed book. So it's not a very short book, and it's not a huge blockbuster. It's a sort of medium-sized book. And I've already written 5 drafts of this novel, and I probably need to do one more before I'm really satisfied with it. This last one will be just making a few small adjustments and tweaks. I'm waiting to get feedback from a second reader at my publisher. And I'll talk in a minute or two about having somebody else reading your work and the advantages and sometimes disadvantages of that. So, as I said, I've already done 5 drafts, but actually, if I think about it, I've really done more than that, because I, like most of us these days, I guess, write straight onto a computer. So I tend to make a lot more changes electronically than are visible in the printed out drafts of my book. I started this activity of writing a long time ago when I was very young. So I've been doing it for more than 50 years now, which is a terrifying thought. And so after all that time, and after having published 6 novels and also written a few more that never got to publication, you'd think I'd know how to do it by now. But for me, it's always a new adventure when I set off to write a new book. And I've always found writing the first draft of a novel is a real struggle and an effort. It's hard work. And even while I keep faith in the idea of whatever it is I'm trying to write, I very often find that that first draft is a slow, frustrating process full of blind alleys and usually full of worries that what I'm writing is really terrible, that it's full of cliches, that it's boring and pointless and of no interest to anybody else except me, and sometimes not even me. So again, this is just to reassure you that if you kind of have all those doubts and worries when you're doing your own writing, that's entirely normal and natural and what you would expect to happen. And probably one of the reasons why I go through that process is because I'm not a great planner. Some writers are meticulous in the way they prepare before they start writing, but I don't do it that way. I obviously have a big idea in my head. I have an overarching theme and a storyline, and I've usually made some rudimentary notes and a brief synopsis. But I don't make detailed plotting notes. I don't break it all down into chapters before I start. And again, as I said, that's not to say that the way I do it is the right way, or that the way somebody else does it is the wrong way. But I think that's one of the reasons why I go through these worries all the time, that what I'm trying to write may not actually work out the way that I planned it, because I don't plan it in that much detail. And for me, part of the process of writing a novel is to find out what it's about and what's going to happen. If I knew that before I started, I probably wouldn't actually bother starting it. So, as I said, getting to the end of the first draft is always a bit of a struggle for me. But it's once I've got the first draft finished that I really begin to enjoy myself. For me, completing the first draft is something akin to maybe a sculptor beginning to work with a big lump of clay. By the end of the first draft, I have got the shape of what the final sculpture is going to be, and I've probably got quite a lot of its essential features, which won't change. And then with subsequent drafts, I begin to fill in all the other details. Maybe I start again with a new lump of clay and sort of, rather than reworking the existing lump, or maybe I just carry on working with what I've got. And every time I write a new draft, many, many things change, from the smallest grammatical corrections, like taking a bit of punctuation out or deleting or changing a word, to much, much bigger changes, like a complete change of the point of view from which the story has been written, or changing the tense in which the story is written, or much more often, changing the order in which the story is being told. So each draft enables me to go back in and make sure that I've got all of these different elements working in the way that I want them to work. So for the next 20 minutes or 25 minutes or thereabouts, I'm going to try and break down this redrafting process into 10 different points. And I've made a little one-page sheet of that. And I think that's going to be available from Moniack Mhor at the end of the talk, and you'll be able to look at that. So it's a sort of summary of the points I'm going to make, so that you can remember what I've told you in the next 20 minutes or so. So there's 10 points, and the first 3 of those points are what I would call, I'm addressing in those what I would call strategic global matters, things that kind of affect the whole big picture of the novel. And then there's another one like that right at the end. And in between, I've got 6 points that I think of as more being about technical and crafting issues. Now, obviously, there are overlaps between the final overall look and feel of your novel and the technical crafting details that you apply to the text on every page. The big picture, if you like, is only achieved by paying attention to those details, but the details only settle down once you have an understanding of the big picture. It's a process that involves those two things interacting with one another. I used the analogy of making a sculpture just now, but I think you can also think of this process as being like making a painting or a film. Any process like this that's a creative process has lots of false starts. And if you're writing doing a painting, you know, you paint over bits, you do little preparatory sketches, you maybe have to blank out whole sections and start again. Or if you're making a film, there's going to be lots of bits that end up on the cutting room floor. And so this whole process always means making mistakes and then coming back and making improvements. So let's start going through these 10 points that I want to make. And the first, as I say, the first 3 are strategic points, if you like, big picture points. So the first one is, what are you trying to achieve when you go through these various drafts of a book? And I'll answer it as what I'm trying to achieve. Very simply, what I'm trying to do is make the book that I'm writing as good as I possibly can. One of the things that I find every time I set out on this journey to writing a new novel is that it always turns out to be different in tone or direction or plot from how I thought it was going to be at various stages of writing it. We're talking about a very complex creative process, and one that can last months usually, and sometimes it can go on for years. I mean, there was one book of mine that took me about 4 years to write. So we're talking about a big, long process where you create a whole world, and so it can get quite complicated. And what I find generally is that the novel kind of gets away from you, and you end up writing in second, third, fourth drafts. You end up writing to the demands or the requirements of the book, rather than it falling easily into place as you bring your ideas into being on paper, or by typing them up on screen. I don't believe this idea that somehow writing is a creative process which kind of just happens from a sort of a thunderbolt of creative genius comes down and hits you and works through your fingers. It's not like that. It's a long, hard process of redrafting and recreating. And with each draft, you have the opportunity to recalibrate, as it were, to check whether what you've said is really what you want to say, and if it isn't, to do something about it. It's my belief, really, that every novel contains flaws and feelings in the eyes of its author, even if everybody else thinks that it's brilliant. And it's because of those flaws and failings that we set off on the road again with the next book. We always aim for perfection and we never quite achieve it. So that's the first thing. What are you trying to achieve when you go through all these drafts? And for me, it's about just trying to make the book you're working on as good as it possibly can be. The second point is, again, it goes back to this balancing act between the big picture and the detail. How much of the redrafting process is about fine tuning, and how much of it is about deconstructing and rebuilding on a grand scale? And maybe, Ange, at this point, can you put up that image of the painting by Velázquez that I sent to you earlier? This is just, yeah, that's great. Hopefully everybody can see that. It's one of my favourite paintings. It's in the National Gallery in Edinburgh, and it's called Old Woman Cooking Eggs by Diego Velázquez. And I just want, to me, this is a great way of trying to explain what I'm talking about here. There's a whole story going on in this painting with these two characters and all this wonderfully depicted images. Velázquez painted this, by the way, when he was about 19 years old, which makes me feel sick with envy. But there's a story in the overall picture. But look at the amazing quality of the way that the cooking eggs are painted. I'm just hovering I don't know if you can see, oh, there's Anne's got the cursor there. And then the egg that the old woman's holding in her hand, and the wooden spoon that she's got. And then further over down in the right-hand corner, you've got this beautiful red onion, and then this lovely jug just along from it. These details are just fantastic, but the details on their own don't mean anything if they're not within the whole picture. And likewise, the whole picture doesn't work without those wonderful details. So that's really, you can probably take that down again now, Ange, thanks very much. But that was really just to say, it's about getting this balance between big pictures and fine tuning right. And in just a moment, I'm going to illustrate this a wee bit by showing you one single page from the book that I'm currently working on across 5 different drafts, and try and point out some of the things that are going on there. We'll have a look at that in just one moment. But before we do that, I'll just move on to the third point, which is this one. Are you working entirely alone on your book, or is anybody else involved in the process? And by that, I mean, if you're lucky enough to have a publisher, then maybe there's an editor, or maybe there's an agent if you have an agent involved. But for most of us, most of you perhaps, you won't be at that stage necessarily, but you may have a trusted reader. This is a kind of character, if you like, in my life, trusted reader. Writing's a very solitary process. fundamentally it's one person doing the thing. And sometimes it can be quite a lonely process. But if you've got somebody else involved who's going to read what you're writing at various stages, what is the role of that person? And how do you, as the writer, how do you stay in control of your own work whilst taking on board any criticisms or points that they may make? My trusted reader is my wife, Marianne. She's the first person that sees anything that I'm writing. And to be honest, being somebody's trusted reader is not an enviable role, especially if you are a close friend or a relative. Because if you are that reader, you don't want to hurt the writer's feelings, but you also have to be honest and upfront about what you think may be not going well with the writing. And that can be a very tricky place to occupy. As the writer, you may feel that you do want someone to look at your work in its early stages, and that can be really, really useful, if for no other reason than to give you the confidence to carry on. But it can also obviously have the opposite effect. If the reader comes back to you with some quite negative feedback, that can undermine your self-belief as a writer. And one thing that any writer needs is self-belief in spades. You really do need to have that belief that you're going to be able to get through this big project and get to the end. And also, draft one, the first draft of what you write, is going to be a mess. That's why it's draft one. Anything at that stage is going to be full of things that are not right. And so getting a reader, however much you trust them, to go over that with a red pen may actually be quite counterproductive, because they may be making commentaries that actually you would have sorted out yourself in draft 2 or 3. So this is just a general point. At that early stage of your writing, I suggest that if you want anything at all from somebody else, you just want some light touch feedback. Somebody to say, yeah, actually this is working, I'm engaged with the story and I'm interested in the characters. Or on the other hand, this is really not credible, the dialogue is stilted, it's just not happening for me, that kind of thing. My own view personally is I don't let anybody seeing what I've done, not even my wife, until I've got to the end of at least the second draft. That is until I feel that I have the shape and substance of the entire book. But I think that's something that's worth bearing in mind. Okay, I'm going to now see if I can share screen here. Let's see if this works. Yeah, now hopefully you can see on your screen a page that starts with the words at the top are "of these matters for tonight." I hope that that's all visible to you all, and you can let me know if you can't see it, but I'm assuming that I'll just keep talking and assume that it's working. So this is the page from what I would call the first draft of the novel I'm writing on at the moment. The details of what's in this don't really matter too much to you, but I'd just like you to, hopefully you can see my cursor moving around there. It's this passage that I've marked with a big black line that I want to concentrate on here. As I say, this is a very, very early draft. It's a draft that didn't even get to the end of the book. But the weather turned again the next day, the sky was low and rain fell steadily, and Charles Glegg sat undisturbed in the library from after breakfast until 3 in the afternoon, and so on and so forth. The process of refinement would come later, but occasionally when some striking phrase entered his head, he made a note of it for future reference. It was not his job to turn it into poetry, the words of the monk who had composed the book, and yet, whoever that man had been, he had had a sense of style. There were flourishes and embellishments that Glegg wanted to reproduce if he could. So the things to note there are that we've got somebody called Charles Glegg. He's working on an old manuscript in a library, and he quite likes the way that the monk who must have written this thing, the monk appears to have had a bit of style. He likes the flourishes and embellishments, and he'd like to reproduce them. Now I'm going to move on now to the next draft. You can see up here I put a wee thing. That's draft 2, this page on the left-hand side. And you can see that things have moved on quite a bit. The weather turned to heavy rain again the following day. My second Sunday here, and there was no possibility of visiting the cave, blah, 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 blah. So the first thing you can see is that the man who was called Charles Glegg in the first passage has now started telling the story instead of being the subject of the story. And you can also see that there's a date at the top there, Saturday the 15th of July, and this has turned into his diary. So that's a big substantial change that has happened between the first draft and the second draft. And you can also see that I have printed this draft out, and I've started making lots of changes. You don't need to really be able to read these. I can't even read my own writing anymore. But you can see all these marks in red where I've made various changes to the text. And I'll talk a bit more about the importance of printing things out rather than trying to do it all on screen in just a minute. The other thing to note is that if I go back up to the first one, at the bottom there's a page number 54, and on this one the page is 73. So there's obviously been some new material added before this. If you look over on the third to draft 3, which is on the opposite page there, you can see we have still got the same diary entry, Saturday the 15th of July, and there seems to be very little that's changing here. All that stuff about wanting to reproduce the flourishes and ornaments of the language of the monk who composed the book, that's all still in there. You'll notice here though, there's some new handwriting in pencil and a different hand, and this is my trusted reader's hand. So at draft 3, I've let somebody else read my book for the first time. And the point that she has picked up here is that there's a little phrase in here, already we are halfway through July. And she has written, is this necessary? And if so, is it in the right place? And when I saw that, I realized that that was a really important reason for having another pair of eyes on this, because that little phrase there, already we are halfway through July, it's really written not by the diary writer, it's written by James Robertson, and it shouldn't be there because the diary writer wouldn't have put that, because he already knows it's the middle of July, because it says so in his diary. So it's a little tiny little thing, but I took that out when we got to the next draft. And hopefully, there we are. Draft 4, again, just this page. It's things have moved on a wee bit. The page number has moved up slightly. And so you're not getting exactly the same episode here, but it's pretty close. I sat undisturbed in the library from after breakfast until late in the afternoon, drawing imitations of the folios, etc. And we've still got this bit in here about the monk who composed the book must have had a good conceit of himself. I'd like to reproduce the flourishes and ornaments of his language, etc. But there are other things that have happened in the meantime. And one of them is, down here at the bottom, you can see that Mr. Glegg has changed, his name has changed to Mr. Gibb. It's a small thing, but as this character developed, I realized that I didn't have the right name for him, and I changed it from Glegg to Gibb. It's a tiny little thing, but it made a big difference in my head about who this man was. And he's developed more characteristics. Now it seems that one of the reasons for him doing this work on this manuscript is he wants, basically he's a freeloader, and he wants to remain in this big house where he's working as long as he possibly can. So he's slowing his work down so that he can continue to get free food and drink while he's living in this big house. If you look on page 5, sorry, draft 5 here, you'll see again that there's virtually no changes now happening. I've changed one little word there. But again, my trusted reader has come in and suggested that I add the year that this is all happening at the start of the diary entry, not just the date. And that's because the novel I'm writing dots about over quite a big period of time. Some of it is set back in the medieval period when the monk is writing the manuscript, and some of it's set in the 20th century. And so my reader, my wife, just thought that it would be useful when people get back to each new section of what is now called the Journal of Charles Kirkliston Gibb, that they were reminded that that bit is set in 1809. And I think that was a really useful thing for somebody to be able to point out to me. The other thing that is here is you'll notice a big squiggle, and I've written in the margin there, time scale out. And that's because as I've been making adjustments to each draft, I've realized that the things that are happening in the diary that Charles Gibb is writing in the diary don't always fit with some of the things that are happening elsewhere. And I'm going to have, so basically what I've had to do is go back and do a whole lot of continuity checks to make sure that that stuff all kind of ties up. And I'm going to talk to you about continuity checks in just a second. So just very, very quickly, there's draft 1, there's drafts 2 and 3, there's drafts 4 and 5, and I reckon I've got another draft to go. So I'm going to now just stop sharing that document, and hopefully you can see me again, I hope. So I want to very quickly, I'm conscious that time is rushing on, so I want to very quickly now go through some more detail, technical details, and I'm going to go through these quite rapidly. The first one is about just what I've been talking about, printing out your work as a physical copy on paper. I've kind of made the assumption that most of us these days write with a keyboard rather than a pen, and that most of our keyboards are linked to laptops and desktops or some other kind of electronical device. So if any of you are still doing it the old way with notebooks or typing on a manual typewriter onto real paper, I salute you. Brilliant. I used to do that, but I've kind of moved on a bit. And it's interesting, actually, I think what you write and how you write, what machine you use and how you write it does have an impact upon the way that you actually write. No question, I think, that the way I think and the way that I transmit my thoughts into writing has changed and over the years. The great advantages of using an electronic device are that you can be quicker, but you're also more inclined to edit and re-edit as you're writing. So rather than the way I used to do it when I used a manual typewriter was I used to think out entire sentences before I started typing. So the danger now, I think, if you're using a word processor is that you tend to junk good sentences rather too quickly. And to counter this danger, I think it's absolutely crucial that at various stages of your writing your book, that you print out and reread and rework your writing from a physical copy rather than just doing it on screen. Some people do this on a daily basis. They print out what they wrote the previous day, they read it up, they mark it up, and then they correct it on the computer and carry on. I tend to do it in bigger chunks. And certainly when I've got a complete draft, I print the whole thing out and go to work on it in the way that we've just been seeing. The interaction between hard copy and electronic versions of your work can be really, really useful in that way. You can have a hard copy sitting beside you on your desk, and as you're going through it, looking at the changes you've made there, you can type in the corrections. And what I tend to find is that I then make further corrections electronically at the same time. So I think it's really important to print your work out and look at it. You just see things on paper that you don't see on the screen. And I really hate using, you know, that on most word processing systems, you can have a track changes thing where you have stuff in the margins. I absolutely hate that. I find it really confusing and difficult. So I certainly don't use that as a way of keeping up with the changes I'm making. I'm also I'm conscious that printing it out means that you have to use up quite a lot of paper, and I try not to do that, but then I can reuse the paper. So you know, you can feel good about yourself by using the other side of the paper at a later stage. But basically, yeah, print it out. Don't throw away your paperwork, and don't erase your electronic files as well. If you're in doubt at all, save what you've got and make a new file. Keep everything. You never know when you may want to retrieve something or go back to a previous manifestation of what you've been writing. The next point, this is point 5, so we're slowly getting through it. I'll try and speed up a little bit, is I think it's really useful at various points to read your work aloud to yourself. It enables you to pick up things that you don't see with your eye. If you read stuff out, you can pick up, for example, whether dialogue is working between characters. Dialogue that works is obviously really important. And when I say that, I don't mean realistic dialogue, because dialogue in fiction is like dialogue in a play. It's not actually the way people really speak all the time, but it needs to work as dialogue. And when you read it out to yourself, you quite often pick up bits where it just doesn't seem to be working very well, and you can sort that out. It also enables you to, when you read something out, to pick up that a sentence is too long or too clumsy or just doesn't make sense. And you can eliminate words that just don't need to be there. One of my big bugbears is adverbs. Words that describe verbs. You know, he rushed into the room quickly. Most of those adverbs can go. They don't need to be there. And when you read stuff out loud, you quite often realize that in a way that you don't when you're looking at it on the page. Another very quick point is between different drafts, I very often change on my, before I print the draft out, I very often change the font that I've written the draft in. That just sometimes can refresh your eye and enable you to see it in a way that you maybe didn't see things that you maybe haven't been picking up on. So it's a very small thing, but if you've got that function to change the font that you're printing out in, I think it's quite a good idea. The next point is point 7 is about making with each draft making checks, continuity checks. This is really about chronology. It's making sure that when you've described a character on page 100, that they are not 6 months younger than they were on page 83. It's that kind of thing, and it's very easy when you're writing a big thing like this to lose track of some of that stuff. Yeah, it's about just making sure that the chronology is right and that descriptions of place and time and so on don't get confused as you're going. Number 8 is what I call research checks, which is similar to but slightly different from continuity. So it's about making sure that if you're writing something set in the 1800s, that you've got all the historical details right. In the novel that I'm just writing, for example, because a lot of it is a man writing a diary in the year 1809, I had to be very careful that I'm not putting words into his mouth that are anachronistic. In other words, that he's not coming out with phrases that just weren't in existence in 1809. And the best dictionary for that is the Oxford English Dictionary, because they give citations about when certain words are used in certain contexts, in the earliest citation and so on. And if you belong to a library, very often you will find that your library membership allows you to have access to the online version of the Oxford English Dictionary. If you're not aware of that, it's worth checking out with your library. It's a really useful facility, and so very often I would have that Oxford English Dictionary online open while I was checking through some of the text to make sure that I wasn't making my character say something in 1809 that actually wasn't available to anybody until 1909, that kind of thing. But it's also about making sure that you get the details of the workings of a steam engine correct, that kind of thing. And also, yeah, I mean, several of my novels are historical novels and inevitably involve a lot of horses. And I know nothing about horses, virtually nothing about horses. So it's about making sure that you get what information you need about those kind of things right, but also perhaps that you don't go into too much detail if you're not sure of what you're talking about. Nearly finished. I'm sorry, it's taken a wee bit more time to get to stage, but we can maybe run on a few minutes at the end if we need to. Point 9 is, as you redraft, it's picking up on smaller things like punctuation and spelling. These are tiny things, but if there are lots and lots of mistakes or things like that wrong at the end of your final draft before you send it off to a publisher or something, it can have a really negative impact on that, on whoever reads it. Nothing puts off a potential editor or agent more than mistakes that look like the author doesn't really care very much about their own work. No publisher is looking for perfection. They're not looking for every single comma to be in its right place. And if there are spelling mistakes, that's not a disaster. But what an editor or an agent is really looking for is a sense that the person who's spent all this time writing this thing has done it with big commitment and passion, and that they really care about it. Because if they don't care about their work, then why should anybody else? So I think, as you go through your various drafts, picking up on all the stuff, these tiny little points about things like punctuation and spelling are quite important. So that's 9 points. The final point, which is going back to a kind of big picture point, if you like, is how do you know when you're finished? That's a big question. And sometimes I wished I had maybe had a wee bit longer on some of my books than I have had. And sometimes I'm happy to just let them go when I did. But I think the only way you can know that you're finished may be sometime after you've actually finished writing the book. So my suggestion is that when you think you're really done with it, is that you put it away and leave it alone for several weeks, even for a month, even for a couple of months. Just get out of your head, and you'll be tired anyway by having spent all this time on it. And then get it back out again, hopefully in a physical printed out form, and have another look at it after you've given yourself some time away from it. And when you come back to it with that fresh eye, you will again see little things that need to be changed. Hopefully you will not see big things that need to be changed because you've dealt with all of those. Raymond Carver, the American writer, once said, quoting another writer, he said, he knew when he was finished writing a short story because he found himself going in and taking all the commas out and then going through it one more time and putting them all back in the same place. So there was nothing more that he could do. It was just tinkering. And at that point, I think you have to say, I have done the best I can do, which is basically where we started. I said, the whole point of redrafting is to make your book the best that it possibly can be. And I think with that stage, when you really feel, no more I can do with this, is you've done the best that you can do. Remember that a book is a two-way process. You've done half of the work. The other half then has to be done by whoever reads it. So it's their turn. And at that point, I think you can say, I have done the very best I can.